Does it make sense for the Maple Leafs to sign Matthew Knies sooner rather than later? And what does a deal look like between Knies and the Buds? Let's dig into that and more on today's edition of the Locked On Leafs podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day.
You're Locked On Maple Leafs, your daily podcast on the Toronto Maple Leafs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome into the Locked On Leafs podcast, a daily Maple Leafs centered podcast hosted by myself, Mike DiStefano, and my co-host, Dave Morassutti. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started. What's going on, Dave? How are we feeling on a Wednesday?
Pretty good. Just make sure how many mosquito bites on my head. I got swarmed today outside. I don't like mosquitoes.
And you know what helps not getting mosquitoes on your head, Dave? Hair. Hair helps sometimes.
A little short in that department.
Yeah. Well, probably not the only department you're short in. Anyways, let's get into today's show. What a start. I chose violence today, Dave. Speaking of choosing violence, do you know who the undisputed number one hated person in the province of Ontario is right now?
Might that be one Arber Xhekaj?
It indeed is one Arber Xhekaj, who is technically an Ontario native, so maybe outside of the Xhekaj family, who's located in the Hamilton area, but yeah, I mean, days after what he did to Cedric Paré, the Maple Leafs, you know, the attack, pretty much getting away with it, just a $3,300 fine. Well, he made another dirty play today, and an even worse move, in my opinion. Late hit, dirty hit, whatever you want to call it, chicken winging the jaw of Tim Stutzle. Completely unnecessary play, which took him out of the game. He got, obviously, a 5-minute major plus a game misconduct. And like that's two very dangerous plays in back-to-back games. I hope the NHL throws the book at this guy now.
It's absolutely ridiculous. Like I was looking at some of the comments from what we were talking about the other day, and someone was like, "Well, you know, Paré turtles when challenged by Arber Xhekaj and things like that." The number one thing I hate the most when players come at the side, like so one player's just skating forward and another guy's coming from the side and blindsides them from the side.
Yeah.
That's number one hit the NHL has been trying to get rid of. Clearly it's not working. And now, you know, Stutzle, that could have been worse. I know he got hurt, but
well, we don't know the extent. We don't know the extent of Stutzle.
Yeah.
Like he didn't return to the game, obviously, and whether or not that was for precautionary reasons or the fact that there's, you know, some injury. You know, I'm sure we'll get more information. We're recording it about 30 minutes after the game's over, so we don't really know exactly what's going on with Tim Stutzle. But it's just a dirty play, and it's just another one that you know you don't need in the game. And the fact that he kind of got away with a dirty play that just isn't part of the game against Cedric Paré, then he goes out and he does this. Like you're right, it's the East-West, you know, blindside hits. Those are the things that the NHL is trying to get out of the game. And, you know, we see a lot of suspensions for plays and hits just like this. So I would imagine the NHL, they fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I'd imagine that they're not going to get fooled again here on a second dirty hit by Arber Xhekaj. I'd expect for a couple of game suspension at the very least. And hey, bake in an extra game for, you know, not suspending him for the Paré situation, because it's just, you know, not something that the league should want in the game. That's you know, plain and simple. Which also, you know, probably means that he won't be there for opening night, I would imagine. So that conversation we had yesterday about fireworks, him and Reeves, good chance that Arber Xhekaj is not going to be playing in that game. If I had to guess.
Yeah, and actually, I saw a tweet from Brian Hayes And you made a great point that there are a lot of these preseason games in the NHL that are against divisional opponents,
Yeah.
which,
All of them, Ottawa, Montreal, Detroit, they've
yeah,
all divisional
yeah.
opponents.
You don't think that these players are going to put a little more, like, sometimes preseason they don't try too hard. When it's in a divisional opponent, maybe you care a little bit more.
Send a
Why?
little message, a little bit of a
Yeah.
message.
So why not go against teams in other divisions? They mix it up a little bit. So you're not you're not pitting teams against rivals in preseason.
Yeah, I'm guessing the answer is travel, right?
Yep.
You know, road less traveled is probably the answer there. So Detroit, Montreal, and Ottawa are close, teams. So that I'm assuming is the answer to it. But yeah, you're right. Like it just fuels animosity between the clubs, and look, there's a lot of guys out there obviously that are looking to make an impression. And Arber Xhekaj is not someone who's like guaranteed an everyday spot in the Habs lineup. He's not like it. I know that it's a name that we all know because last year, Wi-Fi, and he was out there fighting dudes, and he made a name for himself, and good on him. But, when it comes to him being, an everyday player, like an actual top forward level defenseman in the NHL, he's not that. He hasn't proven to be it yet, at least. So, he comes out here and he's like, all right, I know what I have to do. I have to impose my will. I have to play physical. I have to play on an edge. And that's how I'm going to get noticed in a game. But, when he goes way across the line, not once, but twice in back-to-back preseason games, it really just, makes you shake your head, and it's like, man, this, yeah, you hate to see it. At the end of the day, you hate to see it, and hopefully Tim Stutzle will be okay, and we're not talking about an injury or a long-term injury of any kind, because that just wouldn't be good. I think I saw Brady Tkachuk left the game too, if I'm not mistaken, or Shabbat.
Yeah. No, Tkachuk, Shabbat, and Stutzle.
Yeah, all three. Yeah, all three ended up leaving the game for precautionary reasons. It just goes back to the conversation we were having the other day too, where it's like the preseason's just too long, man. And you're risking injury to your main guys, like your main players. Like the more games you play, the more at risk you are for getting hurt, whether it's through something like this, or a weird hit that like Tavares took the other day, or it's you block a shot and you break a bone in your ankle, whatever it could possibly be, a freak accident. There's just no need to have 6 preseason games. And apparently the next CBA, there might be a discussion about shortening the preseason. It might come at the expense of extending the regular season. We can get in depth into that discussion a little bit later on when we go through kind of our takeaways from the Board of Governors meeting that happened over the course of the last couple of days in New York. But why don't we take a quick break? When we come back, let's get into this Matthew Knies conversation, because it's discourse that's certainly picked up over the last 24 hours. There was a report by Elliotte Friedman in the 32 Thoughts podcast talking about the Maple Leafs and, maybe their willingness to try and get something done sooner rather than later. So we could talk about the pros and cons of that happening on the other side. I'm Mike DiStefano with Dave Morassutti. You're listening to the Locked On Leafs podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time has this new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets to your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. The Game Time Picks curates and makes it easier to save more on sports, concerts, comedy, and theater events, whatever you're trying to get some tickets to. They've got great seat views right in the app. You get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you even buy, and they've got the lowest price guarantee, or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game Time. Welcome back into the Locked On at Leafs podcast. It's Mike DiStefano and David Morassutti with you as always here Monday through Friday. That's 5 days a week, 5 podcasts each and every week you get from us here on the Locked On Leafs podcast, a show that you can get wherever you get a podcast and also available through video format up on YouTube. If you enjoy the content, we do ask that you would please subscribe to the show on both platforms. So if you want to watch it or if you want to listen on the go, Apple Podcast, Spotify, whatever you're using, new episodes dropping each and every weekday morning. All right. So there's been a lot of discourse about Matthew Knies of late, and I can't say I'm too surprised. He's a really talented kid. Probably, if not the one of the Maple Leafs top young up-and-comers on the Maple Leafs team. And, he's slated to skate on a line with Mitch Marner and Austin Matthews. So he is definitely a guy that a lot of people have high expectations on going into just his second year in the NHL. And I kind of say that because I think that's important to remember when going through and having the discussion about whether or not the Maple Leafs should be ready to give this guy a long-term deal. Now, it was reported by Elliotte Friedman on the 32 Thoughts podcast this week that the Maple Leafs are interested in engaging in conversation with Matthew Knies in his camp on a potential extension. His deal does end at the end of the year, and he's an RFA, so it's not as though it's a pressing need to get it done, unlike a Marner, Tavares, or a McCabe. But the Maple Leafs might view him as a long-term piece and could see a big season coming for Matthew Knies and might want to get ahead of it with a contract prior to the season. What do you make of this report, and how do you feel about it?
Well, I mean, recall we did have this conversation not too long ago. It was in a co-sign, no sign, and we kind of discussed why the Leafs should be in some way interested in doing a contract now rather than later with Matthew Knies, because you run the risk of, he might actually have a really big year, especially because he's playing in the top 6. So get the deal done now before he really pops off and the price goes up. Because if you listen to the Friedman report, price is not going to go. It seems like at some point the price won't go down. It's just going to continue to climb for Matthew Knies.
Yeah.
But you're also right in that, what are the priorities, right? Where does he rank in the list of priorities for this team, given everyone that they have to figure out going into next year as well?
Yeah, it's definitely something that I think the Leafs will have to think about. But I'll push back on that a little, actually, because he is someone who for sure is going to be part of the future. Yeah. Like, he's an RFA. So, a contract will get done. It's just, all right, we're going to get a short-term deal, a bridge deal, a long-term extension. Which one are we doing? He's still going to be part of this team moving forward, where the other guys, it's like, all right, we got to get something done or these guys are walking. So I would say there's a little less urgency, I guess, just from that perspective. But if they believe, like you and I have mentioned multiple times on this podcast, Dave, that Matthew Knies could have a big season, right? Especially if he's playing up on the top line with Matthews and Marner, they might want to get ahead of it and try and get a long-term extension hammered out now before that number, like you said, climbs to a stratosphere that they're less comfortable with, right? Like, you look at what's going on right now with the Boston Bruins and Jeremy Swayman. That's a very contentious situation brewing out there, pun intended. You don't want the Leafs to get themselves in that type of negotiation. If they can avoid it and get something done early, I think that would be best case scenario for both sides. The question, of course, is, well, what's it going to cost? I think that's ultimately the biggest question that negates whether or not this deal gets done early enough. Because if you're the Maple Leafs, I mean, what do you really know about Matthew Knies? And how comfortable are you giving him, a boatload of money, right? Because we've seen a lot of these 8-7 year deals with players coming out of ELC, and they're signing these contracts in the $6, $7, $8 million range coming out of their entry levels. But those guys have had 2-3 years of playtime, right? They've played 2-3 years in the league. Mm-hmm. Talking, the guy like, Quentin Byfield, Seth Jarvis, Boldy, Alexi Lafreniere, like these guys have played multiple seasons in the NHL. So there's a bit more of a body of work to know what these guys are. Matthew Knies has only played 83 games, Dave. Like, would that concern you if the Leafs are looking to lock him up to a, 6, 7, 8 year deal potentially without knowing exactly what this kid is with very few viewings of him in the NHL?
Well, that's the big one there, right? Is at what point is do you get a little too ahead of like the Utah Hockey Club just gave Gunther a 7-year deal, if I'm not mistaken, right? Like,
yeah, worth still like 7 sheets. And that to me is a little wild.
You kind of go your eyes widen a little bit just because like he's played how many games, right? You get too teams, I think, get too worried that if they don't do these deals now, then they're worried that the player's going to pop off. And it's like, well, I don't know, if you did this a little earlier, you could have gone him at this. But I think with the Leafs, in the Leafs case especially, yeah, Matthew Knies is probably going to be a good player and he's going to be a big part of your team going forward. But you also have to be sensible in that you can only give so much to every player, right? They were smart and they got ahead and they got Bob McMahon signed to that deal that they did. And if he proves to be what he was last year, that's going to be a great deal, right?
Yep. Simon Benoit too. They got him signed to a decent contract early.
Yeah, like I understand that Knies is, as Friedman said, is viewed as a big part of this team's future, but how big, right? And like 6-7 years, that's someone you give like to a high end player usually. Now Tampa Bay, they gave a bunch of guys 6-7 year deals, and they're paying for it a little bit. But part of that was also, we'll give this guy 6-7 years in hopes that he'll take a little less on the salary cap to do that. So
what does that look like, do you think? Like, if we're looking at contracts, the deal that did just get signed by Dylan Gunther, what was that, 7 and change, I believe. Like, is that what you think Knies is going to be looking for on a long-term deal? Because, like, if you take a look at what their records are in the NHL, it's actually pretty similar. Like Dylan Gunther, 78 games in the NHL, 24 goals, 26 assists. That's 50 points in the NHL, right? Through 78 games. Matthew Knies, 83 games, 15 goals, 21 assists for 36 points. So has not necessarily been as productive, I suppose you could say, but he also has played well in the playoffs, and he's a year younger than Dylan Gunther. Actually, no, they were drafted in the same season. No, he's actually Matthew Knies. Technically, you're older, actually, because he was a late birthday. But Dylan Gunther was drafted far, far more ahead as a top 10, viewed as a top 6 winger for them. I don't know. That Gunther contract was a lot. And I just wonder if Matthew Knies' camp looks at it and says, well, this is probably the range we're in, I don't know. Like,
to me, that I would like that. I don't think the Leafs can do that, and really shouldn't do that. Because here's the thing: like Matthew Knies is a good player, but you look at his college. He wasn't a big he was a decent producer, but he wasn't like a massive point producer, right? He's not like, I don't view him as like this elite offensive player. He is going to be good at putting up points, especially in the top 6. But the other thing we have to remember is he a top 6 player from now on end, right? Like last year we said, okay, he can be a top 6 player. Then he wasn't at times. He was moved around the lineup. So I think like that's something that the Leafs are going to have to really consider is what's his role? What is he to this team before they can really go out and do that contract?
Okay, so if they do believe he can be a top 6 player for this group moving forward long term, what does that contract look like for you?
So I would be in like the 4.5 to 5 million range for him
on a long term deal. 4.5 to 5. What's long term for you?
like 4 or 5 years.
Okay, that's midterm.
Yeah.
7,
If I'm
8
doing a
years though.
long term now, if he wants a long term deal, 5.5, right? Like 5.5. Like I can't go over 6. Like 6 is like you're when you get to the 6 million range, then you have to. Then there's certain expectations you're asking of Matthew Knies.
What would he have to do this season for him to be worth $6 million to you next year?
To be worth 6 million. Man. So I'm just looking. Just so I remember his what he did last year.
He had 15 goals, 20 assists last year.
Yeah. So first off, he's gonna have to be like 25 plus goals, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he's got to be in the 50 to 60 point range, at least. So we're like almost, I want to say not doubling production, but close to it.
You don't think he'll be able to do that?
There's a
Playing on a
possibility
top line?
he should be able to do that,
Right.
but that's what I have to see before I even have that conversation.
And that's why I think if I'm Knies, I probably bet on myself this year. I'm Knies in a great spot, right? Being not anointed, he's deserving of being, in the top 6, and where that means playing with Matthews and Marner all season, or maybe it's, playing with William Nylander at times this year. He's in a good spot to produce, right? Like we've talked about how we expect for him to really take a big step. I do expect for him to be, a 25-ish goal scorer this year, get 60 to 70 points. And if that's the case, he probably will be able to wait it out and then get, $6 to $7 million next year. Like, that's the thing. I think that, the Maple Leafs, sure, they'd love to get him, around the $5 million range. But if you're Matthew Knies and you believe in yourself and you had a great summer and you're getting these opportunities in the top 6 of a team that scores a boatload of goals, I probably wait it out. So like if you are the Maple Leafs and you really do want to get something done as soon as possible, I think you're gonna have to push up to into the $6 million range to get something done before the season starts. I don't think 5.5 gets it done on a long-term deal. Maybe a short-term deal if you want to try and get, a couple of years, like 2-year bridge deal, at $5 million a piece, perhaps, you could try and do that. And it's all right. Let's see what else you have in you. But honestly, if I'm Toronto, to your point, if you're willing to get to 5 and you see, okay, if he's a 25 goal scorer, 70-point guy, maybe he's worth 6.5. I might just punt and wait. Honestly, if it costs me an extra $1 million in cap space, at least I have another full season under the belt, knowing what this guy is, and I would feel more comfortable making a long-term investment on a player like that, with at least 2 years of a body of work, not just 1 year of work. You know what I mean?
True. Like that, but that's the big one there, right? Is you have to start to see it, and like usually that's when these contracts happen. In most cases, for teams like the Leafs, they're going to wait for him to show this, during the year a little bit before they even have that conversation. I'm sure they probably have a thought of what they want to do, but they're probably like, let's see what he does coming out of out to start the season before we really, push the envelope on what we want to sign him to.
Possibly. I'll be curious though. Like we've seen so he's going to be 22 on October 17th. So this basically is going to be 22 throughout the whole season. Alexis Lafreniere broke out at 22 years old. Quentin Byfield broke out at 22 years old. Matthew Boldy broke out at 22 years old. Seth Jarvis broke out at 22 years old. And Tim Stutzle broke out at 22 years old. So, if you're looking at an age range where guys really start to figure it out, it is about now. They've grown into their bodies. They've figured out, after a couple of years in the NHL, they kind of know how to go about things. So that's the one thing where if you're the Maple Leafs, do you want to get ahead of the breakout? And at the same time, you do have to make sure that you make it enticing enough where Nye says, you know what? All right, let's put pen to paper. Okay, sure. Let's make this happen. I think it's a number closer to 6 than it is to 5, in my opinion.
Well, I if you to get it done now, to have the agent say, "Yep, let's do this," no brainer, it's probably going to have to be a big enough number for them to say, "Yep, let's just do it."
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll see what happens, but it definitely is an interesting. It's not really a dilemma, but it's a situation, I guess, that the Maple Leafs find themselves in, and we'll see if they get something done sooner rather than later, or if this is something we're talking about, at the start of next off season. I guess we'll know at a later date. Speaking of next off season, the Board of Governors had their meeting this past week, and there was a projection for what the NHL salary cap will look like next year, which also might make things a little, probably put in Knies' favor with the type of increase that they are projecting we see happen next season. Let's get into that. Our takeaways from the Board of Governor meetings. That's coming up on the other side. I'm Mike DiStefano with Dave Morassutti. You're listening to the Locked On Leafs podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Hey, NHL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. It's North America's #1 sports book. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you could check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed anytime you place your first $5 bet. You can bet on whatever you want. NHL futures, Maple Leafs futures. You can bet on this weekend's preseason game. You can make that wager, $5, your first $5 bet, get $200 back in bonus bets guaranteed. That's on FanDuel.com. The Locked On Leafs podcast continues. I'm Mike DiStefano with Dave Morassutti. In New York, the Board of Governors meeting. They were ongoing this week in New York, and a couple of takeaways, I guess, that we have from what was discussed. What wasn't discussed, apparently, though, Dave, expansion didn't even get touched on the docket. So I don't think we have to worry about expansion into Kansas City or going back to Atlanta or wherever. Houston was another one of those teams that have been discussed about a potential expansion. Doesn't sound like it's happening anytime soon. Wasn't even brought up at the meeting this past week. But what was discussed, interestingly enough, was possibly a change to the schedule. So apparently, in the next CBA discussion, the league and the PA might talk about shrinking the preseason and then expanding the regular season. Your thoughts?
Yeah, as soon as I heard that they were thinking about shortening the preseason, I'm like, yes. And they were talking about extending the regular season. I'm like, there's the catch.
Yep.
Because
where it's they had me in the first half, and then I kept reading.
We know why they don't want to just shorten the preseason, because that's money being taken away from the owners. And they, you just look at all the sports leagues right now. I put the NFL there, like to do the expansion of its regular season to add one game. That one game means so much to the NFL, right?
Oh, millions. And they took away a preseason game and added a regular season game. Like, didn't the CFL do the same thing a few years ago too?
Yeah, the CFL only has 2 preseason games.
Yeah,
and 2 or is it 3?
2. I think it's only 2.
Yeah, and then they have 18
games in the league for a living. How do you not know that?
I don't pay attention really much to the preseason.
Exactly. 4 is enough. Like, shrink it to 4 games, maybe even 3, but like 4 at the maximum. And like, let's also move the season up a little bit. Like, I still just don't understand why. Like, we're recording today, October 1st. Tuesday, October 1st should have been the start of the regular season, right? It's now October 2nd, Wednesday, by the time you're listening to this. But like we should be reacting to the opening night of the NHL season today. October 1st should have been the start of the year. And that's what they should do, ultimately. 4 preseason games, you can get into camp by the first week of September. You play your 4 games within like a 10-day span. And then all of a sudden, boom, you're ready to go for October 1st. Drop the puck, get it going. Season's over by June 1st. Boom. Makes everyone happy. Like, why can't we do this?
Because why we want to make everyone happy. It's never really ever the case. It doesn't happen.
No,
but
it's about making the rich richer, ultimately.
Like what do these how many of the actual star play? Like you look at the NFL, how many teams don't play their star players to avoid injuries in a meaningless preseason game, right? Like
almost all of them now.
Yeah,
almost all of them. Like Aaron Rodgers hasn't played a preseason game in like 4 years. Same with Lamar Jackson. Like, and even when, some teams will play their starters, they play them for like 1 series. That's it.
Yeah.
And then boom, in come the backups. Don't need you getting hurt, which makes sense. And I mean, the Leafs have, somewhat done that. I think a lot of teams will do that. Like Joseph Woll's only played 1 preseason game so far, right?
Yeah.
Like, I can't help but feel like that's to make sure that, he's going to have a much larger load this upcoming season if all goes well and he stays healthy. You don't got to waste the game in the preseason on that, right? Save the energy, save the aches, So you can make that argument for every single person out there. Now, that said, it definitely helps some guys make their case, and maybe help some players end up getting some making the team, making the roster with a late push by getting multiple games under their belt. But ultimately, you could find out this information within a 4-game set, and so shrink it. I'm totally down for them shrinking the preseason. I hope it's not at the expense of an expanded regular season. I think 82 games is already enough. I don't know why you would need to go to 84. I mean, again, it's about money ultimately, but it just doesn't make sense.
And look what MLB did, right? Instead of adding to its regular season, they did the wild card round, and look at what that's done for, the end of the season, how much it means.
Oh,
right?
You don't want to get a play-in. Are you suggesting the NHL?
No, I'm not suggesting the NHL do a
play-in. The NBA did it. The NBA did a play-in.
I hate the NBA play-in. It's so brutal.
But it's more revenue, Dave. It's more revenue.
I mean, don't forget the Lakers won an in-season championship last year. Do you remember that?
Yeah, no, right? Actually, I don't remember that.
I remember it.
Who cares about that? Well, actually, here's a quick question for you, just on the conversation of this. Would you rather a play-in game, right? Like a quick play-in round, whatever, you can get an extra 1-2 games, or would you rather like an 84 or 86 game regular season?
I'd rather have the play-in. I'd rather just the 2 teams that are on that, but like the final 2 teams to make a playoff spot. You 2 play a 1 game, play it all.
Yeah.
And see who goes and gets that final spot, rather than I don't want to see more regular season games, because guess what? We're going to get to game 58 and we're going to be like, it's going to feel dragging, right? It's going to drag. And
I'll say this, it's kind of built like the NHL, the way that it works. It's like somewhat built for a play-in. Like you have your 3 and 3, right? Like your 3 teams in the Atlantic, 3 teams in the Metro, and then you basically can have 3, like your 2 wild card spots up for grabs in like a 3-team playoff. Essentially, it is kind of built for it, but
it is.
It doesn't.
And that's why they asked the NHL about a play-in, a few years ago, and Batman's just
he said no. Nope. Yeah, he said no. But again, why wouldn't you rather extend a play-in? And I guess the answer is it cheapens, the playoffs. Like if you do finish as the second wild card or the first wild card team through 82 games through your regular season, should your season be decided by one game, one loss? And you can make that argument, no, right? Like for
True.
years, it's been, hey, we've played 82 games to earn this wild card position. Now it's going to be taken away from me because, I don't know, a bad bounce. Like it's hockey, bad bounces happen all the time. So that would be the argument where it's, the league might not want to do that. Hockey purists might not want to do that. But if we're talking about revenue generating, I would much rather see. I, I, I don't know. I kind of sit on the fence, but like maybe that playing would be a little more exciting for the fan, for the teams and the fan bases. It might not be great for those three teams that are battling it out, but I would think that there's, in a one game playoff, there's just a lot more to play with. Perhaps, you could do something there, but I don't know. We'll see. Again, that's all just open for discussion in the next CBA. We'll see if it ends up happening. Apparently, they're going to start talks this summer about the new CBA. Hopefully, they can get something done so that there's no lockout because ain't nobody want that.
That word. Don't want to hear that L word.
No one wants to hear that. Also, the salary cap projected to be at $92.5 million next season, up from the $88 million that it is this year. So that would be an increase of $4.5 million. And I quickly went and did the math. The Maple Leafs currently have just over $61.5 million already locked up. So they'd have just over 30 million basically in cap space, like just over 30 million basically in cap space, close to 31. And basically they'll have Tavares, Marner, McCabe, Knies. We'll see if Holmberg and Robertson are worth signing, but they're also RFAs. But basically Knies, Tavares, Marner, McCabe as the big boys to get signed that will probably make up a chunk of that 30 million in space. But hey, that extra $4.5 million, again, to go back to the conversation, if you're Matthew Knies, it's like, hey, if we're talking percentage of the pie, there's an extra $4.5 million of pie available. Why don't I just wait before making that deal, signing that deal now, as opposed to in the summer? I'm sure Marner's thinking the same thing. I'm sure he's thinking the exact same thing. But anyway, anything else that any other takeaways from the Board of Governors that you saw floating around there?
No, not really. It didn't seem like there was a whole lot other than the salary cap and
the one in I think it's March is the one that's usually more pressing. This one's kind of just some, tying up some loose ends type of stuff, preliminary talks, and that was really the big stuff. I think the shrinking preseason, potentially expanding regular season was kind of a shock factor thing to read about. And then, the first projection of the salary cap next year, which we all projected was going to be around that anyways, with that 5% escalator to be in the $92.5 million range. All right, that'll do it for us here today on the podcast. I'd like to thank you all for listening and supporting the show. You could subscribe to the Locked On Leafs podcast on all platforms and receive daily Leafs content. Follow myself on X at Mickey_Canuck. Follow Dave at D_Morassutti, and follow the show as well at Locked On Leafs. We'll be back with another episode for you guys tomorrow. But until then, keep it locked right here on Locked On Leafs.